All right, everyone, welcome back. Today we're gonna tackle a tough one. Tiananmen Square, 1989.
Yeah, a lot of you have sent excerpts from the Wikipedia article, and it's heavy stuff.
Definitely. But that's what we do here, right? Dig into these complex historical moments and try to make sense of them.
Absolutely. And with Tiananmen, it's impossible to understand those few days in June without going back a bit further, back to the 80s in China.
The 80s, big hair, leg warmers.
Well, in China, it was a time of massive change, yeah, but not that kind. Think more like a society trying to reinvent itself after decades under Mao Zedong.
Right. And not always a smooth transition, I imagine.
Not at all. You had incredible economic growth, but also huge social upheaval. Like a country hitting the gas on modernization while still figuring out the directions.
And the article mentions this thing called the Iron Rice Bowl, which sounds pleasant enough, but I'm guessing there's more to it.
Yeah, the iron rice bowl is really key to understanding the anxieties simmering beneath the surface. Imagine, under Mao, there's this unspoken pact, right?
Yeah.
You work for the state, and in return, the state basically takes care of you for life.
Wow, like a cradle to grave kind of deal.
Exactly. Jobs, housing, healthcare, it was practically guaranteed. But then, with these new economic reforms, that iron rice bowl starts to crack.
Oh, so people are going from this sense of, like, total security to suddenly facing an uncertain future. I bet that didn't go over so well.
It did not. You had unemployment, competition, this fear of being left behind. And it wasn't just economics. It became about the Communist Party, their grip on power.
Right, because their whole legitimacy was tied to providing that security, that stability.
Exactly. Now their whole system is being challenged as this new market economy takes shape.
So you've got all this pressure building, this tension between the old way and the new way. And at the heart of it is this question: who really holds the power in this new China?
Precisely. And as we'll see, that becomes the big question that just won't go away.
So we've got this, like, pressure cooker of change happening in China. And then right in the middle of it all, you have the death of Hu Yaobing. And the article makes it clear this wasn't just any death. This was, well, almost like a spark that set everything off.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate the impact of Hu Yaobing's death. He represented something different, you see, something that a lot of people, especially young people, really connected with.
Like he represented the hope for a more open China.
Exactly. He was seen as a reformer, someone pushing for change within the party itself, even a degree of political liberalization, which was, well, pretty radical for the time.
So when he dies in '89, it's not just mourning. It's like this explosion of frustration, of dashed hopes.
Exactly. And remember all that tension we talked about, the economic anxieties, the questions about the party's control. How Yu's death becomes this focal point for all of that, like a lightning rod.
And that's when the protests begin. But these weren't your typical student protests, right? Like this wasn't just about tuition hikes or dorm food.
No, this was different. This was bigger. The students had these demands, these 7 demands the article mentions, and they were fascinating.
The 7 demands. Okay, lay it on me. What do they want?
Well, some were practical, right? Like
Ugh.
better funding for education. But then they went way beyond that. They demanded a free press, tackling government corruption, even calls for democratic reforms.
Well, so they're basically challenging the whole system.
Right.
What was the government's response to that? I mean, talk about bold moves.
It was a mixed bag, honestly. Some officials wanted dialogue, wanted to de-escalate things, but others, the hardliners within the party, they saw this as a direct threat, an affront to their authority. And remember, this is all happening on a global stage. China's trying to present this image of modernization, of stability, and suddenly you have these massive protests challenging their entire power structure. It was, well, not a good look.
Talk about bad timing, right?
Right.
This is all happening right when Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, is visiting China. That had to be awkward.
Awkward is putting it mildly. Gorbachev's visit was supposed to be this big display of China emerging as a global power. Instead, the whole world is glued to the students in Tiananmen Square. And for the protesters, well, it gave them a much bigger platform, didn't it?
Yeah, now it's not just internal pressure anymore. It's the whole world watching to see how China is going to handle this.
Exactly. And the stakes just got a whole lot higher. You've got a country in transition, a government divided, the eyes of the world watching. And then things get even more intense.
The hunger strikes.
The hunger strikes. The students put their lives on the line, literally, to make their voices heard.
Man, you can just feel the tension building and building with each detail in this article. Protests, hunger strikes, the whole world watching,
Yeah.
and a government trying to figure out what to do. And then June hits, and it seems like everything just explodes.
Yeah, June '89 in Beijing was, well, The article describes it as chaotic, and honestly, that might be an understatement. There were these clashes between protesters and the military, this feeling that things were slipping out of control.
And this is where the story gets really murky, isn't it? The article mentions conflicting accounts of what actually happened, especially when it comes to the crackdown.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to remember that even after all this time, we're still dealing with a lot of unknowns. The exact number of casualties, what happened in those final days and hours, it's still debated. Some estimates say hundreds were killed, others say thousands, plus who knows how many were injured.
It really shows you how, even with a huge historical event like this, getting a clear picture can be almost impossible.
It's tough, for sure.
The article does talk about one specific incident, though something about a military vehicle being set on fire sounds like a major turning point.
It was. The incident with the APC, that's an armored personnel carrier, basically a troop transport. It's often seen as the moment things shifted in the crackdown. Protesters set it on fire, and the stories about what happened to the soldiers inside are, well, they're pretty awful.
Yes.
Some were burned alive, yeah. Others were, some reports say they were beaten to death.
God, that's brutal.
It is.
And I guess it shows how in those situations, the lines between, right and wrong, victim and aggressor, they can get incredibly blurry.
Absolutely. You have fear and anger and desperation on every side. And it's crucial to remember this wasn't a simple case of good guys and bad guys. It's very likely there were people in the military who, maybe even sympathized with the protesters. And I'm sure some protesters resorted to violence. It's messy. It's tragic. Trying to fit it all into this simple story just doesn't do it justice,
It doesn't. And this is, of course, where that term massacre gets attached to Tiananmen Square.
Yeah. And as we've been talking about, the truth is way more complicated than that one word can capture. There was violence in the days leading up to June 4th and in the days afterward, but what actually went down in Tiananmen Square, that's still something people are trying to piece together, even now.
So after the crackdown, after everything calmed down, what happened then? The article mentions political purges, international condemnation, but it also says China had this massive economic boom in the years that followed. It almost feels like this strange mix of repression and progress all at once.
That's a really good way to put it. It really was both of those things. The government cracked down harder than ever, got rid of officials they thought were sympathetic to the protests, and really took control of the story. They pushed this narrative that the protests were this dangerous uprising, this threat to the country, that they had asterisk to do something.
And any mention of Tiananmen Square, any attempt to question the official story, that was shut down, right?
Yeah.
Even now, decades later, it's still incredibly sensitive in China.
It is. Talking about it openly is still pretty much taboo. The government's gone to huge lengths to make sure people forget about June 4th, censoring online info, cracking down on any kind of commemoration. They're serious about controlling that narrative.
It really makes you think about the people who are actually there, who still carry those memories. The article mentions the Tiananmen Mothers, this group who, well, it's just heartbreaking.
It really is. The Tiananmen Mothers are parents who, they lost their children in the crackdown. And for decades, they've been demanding answers, accountability, some kind of justice. And they face constant surveillance, harassment, even detention just for speaking out. But they continue to fight to keep the memory of their children alive.
It's a powerful reminder of how Tiananmen Square wasn't just some abstract event. It had, and still has, this incredibly human cost. And that's something the government can't erase, even if they try to control the story.
Exactly.
So, after diving deep into all of this,
Yeah.
where do we even begin to make sense of what's the legacy of Tiananmen Square?
It's a question people are still grappling with, both in China and around the world. I think Tiananmen Square was more than just a protest. It was like a breaking point. It revealed these deep cracks in Chinese society, these tensions between wanting freedom but also control, between holding on to tradition but also wanting to move forward. And those tensions, they haven't gone away. They're still there, simmering under the surface of this country that's now, a global superpower.
Yeah. And the article ends on this, I don't know, kind of an uncertain but maybe hopeful note. It mentions that even within the Chinese government, there have been these whispers of regret. Like even some officials privately admit it was a tragedy. It makes you wonder if maybe someday there could be a different way to remember Tiananmen Square.
Maybe. Memory is a powerful thing. And even with the censorship, with the silence, June 4th, 1989, it's still shaping how we see China, its past and its future. The story of Tiananmen Square isn't over. It's still being written.
That's a powerful thought. And on that note, I want to thank you both for joining us today for this deep dive into such a complicated and honestly heartbreaking topic.
Thanks for having me.
It's one that deserves our attention, though,
Yeah.
deserves our reflection, and our hope that maybe understanding can still win out. Thanks for listening, everyone.